The Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagame nowadays is something analyzed to an extreme extent. Every topping deck list is profiled somewhere on YouTube, shared somewhere on Facebook, and passed on through word of mouth. With all this information passed on, ideas circle constantly, and the game overall became and becomes what most would consider solved after a while. Take the recent metagame Dinosaur, Dragon Link, and Infernoble, where pretty much the decks you pick between if you choose to attend an event with serious intent of winning. Pretty much the entire time I've played competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! It has felt like this. It was once Sky Striker, Orchest, Salamangrate, and Thunder, then it moved to Spiral, Shadal, or Dragon, and then on to Eldritch or Rock. For my competitive venture with Yu-Gi-Oh!, it has always felt like the competitive scene had such limited variation if you truly wanted to compete. The meta has always seemed so oppressive to the variance and diverse nature of what I wish the Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagame was. Some of you may have seen the Luxury Tournament a few months ago. Organizers held a retro tournament for the September 2011 Yu-Gi-Oh! Format. Looking into the format and doing more and more research really opened my eyes to what Yu-Gi-Oh! Could be and what it has been. The diversity in deck choice, deck building, and the emphasis on the grind game was really unlike anything I had ever seen in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! As I delved deeper into the format and played it more and more locally, I realized why I enjoyed it so much. The current Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagame is enjoyable from a competitive aspect in my opinion. However, 2011 Yu-Gi-Oh! Feels so much more like an ideal game of Yu-Gi-Oh! In comparison to what I'm used to. Diversity in the field and devotion to long turns of the grind game, thus making the decisions you make in both deck building and decision making more important exponentially. Now, I do think that these are fantastic qualities in a format. However, the point of this video is not to trash on the current game of Yu-Gi-Oh! It has its pros and its cons, just like anything. But I do feel like the 2011 September format of Yu-Gi-Oh! The scene is incredibly underrepresented in discussions of legacy formats. I wanted to take the time in this video to show you the 2011 Yu-Gi-Oh! Format. I'm not a veteran, so I apologize if I get some things wrong here and there, but this should prove as a steady baseline introduction to the format. The card pool is all the cards legal under the September 2011 ban list, and the sets legal at the time were anything prior to Photon Shockwave. Shockwave was under the same ban list, but introduced Rescue Rabbit and cards like Evil Zerdolka and Logia to the format. This drastically shifted the meta, so they aren't included in the card pool. Now, for an introduction to the ban list at the time. In terms of the new bans on the September 2011 ban list, this was the ban list that banned Fishborg Blaster, Giant Trunade, and Royal Oppression. These bans generally made the format a lot healthier and removed some very degenerate cards that no one really wanted to be playing against. In terms of new movements on the limited side of things, Blackluster Soldier Envoy the Beginning went from banned to legal for the first time in years on this list. This movement really helped the viability of Chaos within the format. And aside from that, BLS was put into most decks that could theoretically summon him. He was certainly a powerhouse in 2011. Debris Dragon on this list also went from 2 copies to 1, along with Lone Fire Blossom. Both of these were hits to the extremely strong Plant Synchro deck that had ruled the last format. Even more hits to Synchro strategies ensued, with the limiting of both TG Hyper Librarian and Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. The strength of 6 Samurai was hit as well, with both Smoke Signal and Shien being limited on this list. Power cards like Avarice and Heavy Storm went from banned to limited on this list as well, increasing the amount of powerful staples available for pretty much every deck. These cards were played in almost every strategy throughout the format. Relevant movements to the semi-limited list included Necrogardna, Summoner Monk, and Tragodia. Call of the Haunted also went from 1 to 2 on this list. Relevant unlimits on this list were Judgment Dragon, a boost to the previously hit Lightsworn deck, Spirit Reaper, Mystical Space Typhoon, and Icarus Attack, a relief on the many hits that Blackwing had stacked up over the years. There are a number of monsters that pop up in a fair number of different decks in 2011. The most important staple here arguably being Tour Guide from the Underworld. Playing 3 guides and 1 Sangan became uniform on the release of Generation 4s, being able to easily toolbox for either number 17 or Levier, alongside with the versatility of Sangan, made this package a meta staple, and something that demanded a large price point at the time. A staple of similar importance and prominence at the time was Gorz, the Emissary of Darkness. This card warps the format by itself. Often you will see players pass without attacking, just to make sure they play around the possibility of a Gorz. Strictly, his existence creates a game state that requires being conservative. Tragodia is another popular card within the format with a similar effect on the game, making players hold back, prepping for a monster to drop after damage connects. Other relevant monsters seen as staples would be hand traps like Valor, Crow, and Maxi, generally present within most side or main decks. Valor, I would say, being the most prominent as it covers the most matchups at the time. Thunder King Ryo is another meta-warping card that saw a lot of play at the time. His versatility and strength into tour guide openings made him an oppressive force alone. Many decks at the time built around this, limiting the amount of search cards they would play so they wouldn't be stunned to death by a Ryo. Moving forward, there are a lot of popular spells within the format, of course. The most common to see in pretty much every deck would be Heavy Storm, Dark Hole, Mystical Space Typhoon, Reborn, and Pot of Avarice. The spell lineup, I think, is a big reason the games can feel so back and forth. Most decks have access to the same equalizers. This forces both players to be conservative and watch how much they commit to the board at any given time. Rarely will you see a versed player commit to a board without a Stardust Dragon ready to protect them, unless they plan to go for lethal into little to no back row. Pot of Duality, Book of Moon, and Mind Control are also quite popular, but not to the degree of the other cards I mentioned. Unlike nowadays, trap cards within 2011 are for the most part present in every strategy. Most decks have some variation of Solemn Judgment, Solemn Warning, Mirror Force, Trap Dust Shoot, and Torrential Tribute within them. Cards like Bottomless and Dimensional Prison are also present within the format, but not quite as common. It is also notable that even though Royal Oppression was banned within this format, Vanity's Emptiness was legal and popped up in a lot of side decks as anti-meta tech. There are a lot of viable decks in terms of competitive 2011 play. Lots of rogue decks are really able to keep up and compete with the more obvious meta threats, and the pool of what you can play with is massive. I really want to do my best here to cover a few of the many available options so you can really get the idea of what you can play with and how the meta shapes up. I'll go ahead and start with Plant Synchro. And now, though in this format there was an incredible diversity of what you could play, the heralded deck of the time, considered the best, was Tengu Plant, the deck that utilized a toolbox of powerful plant cards like Spore and Lone Fire Blossom, and paired that with cards like Reborn Tengu in order to synchro climb. The strength of this deck was the ability to solve any given situation they were presented with their staple spells and traps matched with their powerful synchro monsters and plays like Trishula and Brienne. Another notable, formidable choice within the 2011 format was TG Stun. This deck actually won the luxury event I mentioned earlier, beating a field of plant players with their suite of floating beast-type monsters paired with incredibly powerful stun equalizers like Skill Drain and other trap cards to reduce the effectiveness of the power Synchro Plant is infamous for. This deck really struggles in games 2s and 3s admittedly, but it is a solid anti-meta strategy without doubt. Okay, so Dark World. Now this is a strong aggro deck in the format and functions in a completely different way compared to most of the other contenders available. This deck really aims to overwhelm. The amount of advantage this deck can amass within just a few turns, utilizing power cards like Jar and Card Destruction, is unlike literally any other deck in the format. Though decks like Dark World and TG Stun can certainly have a hard time fighting into game 2s and 3s against side deck tech, both decks really have a good time in game 1 against the most rep deck within the format, being Tengu Plant. it is noteworthy that Dark World's representation at bigger events didn't really pick up until the release of Dark Smog in the next format. However, in the September format, this deck is absolutely still a competitor, and it is so much fun. Next up on the list is going to be Agents. Now, the Fairy Toolbox mixed in with the Tour Guide engine really gives this aggro deck the tools it needs to play into any matchup with loads of utility and strength. Master Hyperion alone is a fantastic card, and the Synchro and XZ toolboxes coming from this deck really amounts to a very present aggro game. Another important note is that this deck was obviously known to be strong prior to this format, and it had actually won Worlds a month before the September Banlist came into play. So even though Tengu Plant was heralded as the best deck this format, I have heard people make arguments for Agents being that deck. Similar to GOAT format, Chaos takes many different forms within 2011. From a pure build, generally abusing Dimensional Alchemist, to hero Chaos builds, and even Chaos Piper builds. There are so many ways to pilot a Chaos strategy within this format, and because of that, I really think it has become my favorite deck to experiment with. The amount of different deck building choices you can make utilizing the Chaos engine is insane, and the Piper variant specifically I just think is so much fun. If you guys are going to explore this format, I definitely think that deck is worth a try, at least a little bit. Gladiator Beast had obviously already seen a lot of success in other formats, so its ability to compete in 2011 is pretty much a given. The deck really operates in a way no other deck ever has, at least on the competitive scene, really utilizing the battle phase to pivot into utility and strong boss monsters like Gyzaras. This is one of those decks whose playstyle has completely been power crept out of modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, and playing with and against it is really, really refreshing. Leading up to this, Blackwing had obviously had better formats. The hits are very obvious, and they do a number on the consistency of this deck. All that being said, Blackwing is certainly a viable rogue option within this format. The power given to a deck being able to utilize cards like Icarus Attack and Armor Master really shouldn't be underestimated. And Shora continues to be a strong tool, even in the year 2011. Unfortunate that Gale, Kalut, and Whirlwind were all at one, but it really is just a tribute to show how strong all the Blackwing cards are, and the fact that they're still playable with all those hits just goes even more to show the power of every individual card within the engine. Next up is another interesting one, being Frog Monarch. Now, using the infinite tribute fodder that the Frog engine provides, you can easily summon cards like Caius the Shadow Monarch and Light and Darkness Dragon. It is some of the coolest shit I have seen within the format, undoubtedly. Now, Frog Monarch, it's just one of those really iconic decks that really lets the player experiment with the tech they want to play. There are so many interesting tribute monsters within the format that I think aren't given justice by the people who were playing Frog Monarch at the time. I think this deck is really cool, and it is definitely viable within the format. The Monarch cards are just flat out amazing in this format, and I just think this deck is a lot of fun. It is definitely worth a try.
I was clapping fools, sending fools back to Fortnite with Machina.
Okay, so Machina Gadget. Now, this deck, once again, it's another one of those strange ones. The playstyle is simple. You use gadgets and cards like Machina Fortress and Gearframe, alongside strong traps to control the game. And as simple as that is, it is truly very effective. The deck kind of at first glance seems underwhelming when I looked into it, but the strategy has a number of strong suits that do it lots of favors. The biggest weakness is obviously the present Cyber Dragon and side decks that does a number on any machine deck, but even so, I think the deck is worth testing. You might be surprised by how fun it can be. And obviously, combos like Ultimate Offering into a gadget, summoning Triple Utopia, it's just some funny shit. Like, this deck is responsible for some really goofy plays that I think are worth trying. So now I want to cover Six Samurai, Karakuri, Infernity, X-Saber, and Dragoonity. Now I put all these decks together because they all accomplish a similar goal, taking different routes to do so. At their high points, all these decks can be very successful synchro spam archetypes. that use the engine they are assigned to pump out boss monsters. All these decks really share a similar weakness, though, to the ever-present Max C. However, all of these decks really have a high ceiling, and the different ways they go about pushing into boards makes all of these decks definitely worthwhile to test. However, I would warn you that by choosing to play any of these decks doesn't necessarily guarantee you an interactive game. Even in this format, Infernity is Infernity, and you're still able to go triple barrier with Doom Dragon on the field. And at that point, like, you might as well just be playing standard. Okay, so yes, Fish is playable in this format. Please, however, don't fucking play it. Holy shit, this deck actually plays like 10 bricks that in hand are like significantly worse than if you were to just play vanillas. When this deck gets its objective off and you resolve the big fish, yes, you do just win. But oh my god, the payoff is not worth bricking on 6 shitty water monsters every other game. Anyhow, I have to admit, this deck is funny, so I thought I would give you the option. But remember, funny isn't going to equal fucking good. Barring my own personal bias on this deck and the way it forces itself to be built, this is one of the reasons Fishboard got banned on the September ban list. This deck, at its best, is certainly a force to be reckoned with. I could honestly keep going with examples of relevant rogue and meta decks that are worth your time to check out and playtest. The pool of cards is so large within this format that your options for decks to play genuinely feels endless. The dynamic of this format is my favorite of any legacy or modern format I have dived into, and the fantastic counterplay working around popular format staples like Gores, Heavy, and Darkhole creates many game states where both players really have to think about each action. This works to create a slow back and forth, constantly, that I really do wish was still present in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, at least more often. I'm not going to preach September 2011 as some sort of golden age for Yu-Gi-Oh! I love the game in every state it has taken, and I think there are goods and bads to each format through the history. This format, just like any format, has its flaws. However, I do think it's an injustice how underrepresented this format is when people are talking about legacy formats. September 2011 was a fantastic year for Yu-Gi-Oh! And I cannot recommend it more. I really hope you guys enjoyed my take on the legacy format, and I hope I've inspired you guys watching who haven't tried it out to try it out. And until next time, thank you guys, and goodbye.